Mr. Potter and Tabby Toot the Horn. Loud music. Mr. Potter and his fine cat Tabby were neighbors to Mrs. Teaberry and her good dog Jig. Mr. Teaberry and Mr. Potter had a lot in common. They both liked bingo. They both liked free samples. They both liked rain. And they both liked music. Mrs. Teaberry liked country music the best. She liked the broken hearts. She liked the big silver boots and the tall hair. Mr. Potter liked opera. He also liked broken hearts, and he liked the big round horses, heroes, and the violins. Some days, Mrs. Teaberry would play her country music very loud for Mr. Potter to hear. Some days, Mr. Potter would play his opera very loud for Mrs. Teaberry to hear. They liked sharing. One day, Mrs. Teaberry had an idea. "We should join a band," she told Mr. Potter. "But I can't join a band," said Mr. Potter. "I can't play an instrument." "Of course you can," said Mrs. Teaberry. "Old people can do anything they want." "Can they say they can't play an instrument?" asked Mr. Potter. "No," said Mrs. Teaberry. So she and Mr. Potter went to look for a band. Tough teeth. Mr. Potter and Tabby and Mrs. Teaberry and Jig went to hear many bands play. They went to hear an Irish band play jigs. But the jigging made Tabby nervous and Jig itch, so they could not play in an Irish band. Next they went to hear a brass band. But the brassy sound made Mrs. Teaberry's teeth hurt, so they could not play in a brass band. Then they went to hear a jazz band. The band played very late in a club after midnight. Mr. Potter fell asleep, so they could not play in a jazz band. Poor Mr. Potter and Mrs. Teaberry. It seemed that bands were only for people who had tough teeth and didn't need much sleep. They sat with Tabby and Jig and wondered what to do. Mr. Potter can't. "I have it," said Mrs. Teaberry a few days later. She had brought Mr. Potter and Tabby some peach tea and a carrot pie. "We will be a band." "But I still can't play an instrument," said Mr. Potter. "Of course you can," said Mrs. Teaberry. "I can't," said Mr. Potter. "You can if you want to," said Mrs. Teaberry. Mr. Potter thought about Tabby's nurse and Jig itch, and Mrs. Teaberry's teeth. He thought about a nap. "I'm not sure if I want to," said Mr. Potter. "If you try, I will bake you something sweet," said Mrs. Teaberry. "Sweet?" said Mr. Potter. "Something really nutty," said Mrs. Teaberry. "Nutty?" said Mr. Potter. "With lots of vanilla," said Mrs. Teaberry. I'm ready to play, said Mr. Potter. Mr. Potter tries. The next day, Mr. Potter bought a little horn. He bought it because it was on sale. When he got home, Mr. Potter tooted the horn up for 4 hours. He was very bad tooter, the worst. Tabby went outside to sleep in the ferns. Mrs. Teaberry did not buy a horn to toot. She bought a mandolin. When she got home, she started plucking. She was a good plucker. She plucked all night long, and Jig did not itch. By the next morning, Mrs. Teaberry could pluck her favorite country songs, but Mr. Potter could not toot his favorite songs. His tutor was holding up a tomato plant. The band. Mrs. Teaberry forgave Mr. Potter for being a bad tutor. She said he could listen to her pluck instead. So he did. He listened to her pluck all the broken-hearted songs she could think of. He liked it very much. Tabby purred. Jig did not itch. After the concert, they all had a sweet, nutty, vanilla surprise. Mrs. Teaberry said Mr. Potter deserved it because he had tried. She said she did not mind being the only person in the band. She said the name of her band would be Plucking Without Potter. And they laughed and laughed and laughed.